Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at another DDR5 overclock, this time with an Intel CPU. So the system specs here are an i9-14900K, which was provided by Intel, so big thank you to them for sending over the CPU. The motherboard I'm using is a Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Master X, which was provided by Gigabyte, so big thank you to them for the motherboard. And the memory kit is a Corsair Vengeance RGB kit that was provided by Corsair, so thank you to Corsair for the RAM. And the spec on the memory kit is DDR5-6000 CL30 at 1.4 volts. It's a 2x24GB memory kit, and the memory chips that it's using are Hynix 24GB MDI, and because it's 24 gig DIMMs with 24 gigabit memory chips, this is a single rank memory configuration. Or like the sticks are single rank, and also because each stick is on a different memory channel, each channel has one rank of memory on it, right? So it's single rank sticks running in single rank. Because technically, if I had 4 of these sticks, then we'd have a dual rank configuration. Yeah, well, we'd have it would be dual rank on Z790. If we had a higher channel count CPU, then it would be not dual rank potentially. But ranks are annoying. Anyway, so that's the. Oh, I guess also I should draw attention to the fact that, yes, I do have a fan pointed directly at the memory sticks. For the settings that we're running here right now, I don't think this is actually a necessity, but because I tend to run open air test benches, the whole pointing a fan at the RAM is kind of a habit at this point. I just really, it just sits there, so there's really no reason not to do that in this setup. Obviously, if you have an actual case, pointing a fan directly at your memory sticks is a bit more complicated, because it won't just, sit on top of them like it does here. But yeah, I'd say if you're going to be pushing DDR5, you should probably consider doing something about the cooling, because DDR5 does tend to run hot, and it just generally makes memory stability easier to maintain. Because the thing is, it's not, with memory temperatures, the concern isn't so much, unless your memory sticks are going, over 85 degrees Celsius, you really don't have to be concerned about, damaging the memory sticks. The real concern is that, depending on what kind of memory settings you're running, so what kind of timings you're running, and what kind of speed you're at, if the memory gets too hot, it's going to not be stable. Right, which can lead to annoying issues like, oh, it was fine when I ran the memory stress test, but then playing games, it gets unstable because heat from the GPU destabilizes the memory sticks, which is not something I've really tested, because I don't run, closed cases. So, yeah, but that is a potential issue that you can run into in a, closed case configuration, where just the GPU is going to dump heat onto the memory sticks. Or more like dump heat into the case, which is going to raise the internal case temperature so high that the memory sticks then have the stability negatively affected. And just having more airflow over the memory sticks in that scenario can help deal with that kind of issue. Though in this configuration on an open air test bench, this is honestly kind of excessive, considering that I'm not really using very high memory voltages or pushing the settings that hard. But anyway, let's move on from the cooling considerations here. Now, one neat thing about Corsair memory kits is that they have a version number. Because if you're wondering, how do I know that this uses Hynix 24 gigabit MDI memory chips? Well, there's 2 ways to know that right now. One, there's the version number on the memory stick, and I'll explain how that works shortly. The other option is that, well, the spec, these are 24 gig DIMMs, and they're DDR5-6000 CL30. The only other 24 gigabit memory chip that I'm aware of is made by Micron, and that one doesn't do CL30 at 6000. It might do CL30 at 5200 or something. So there's the spec method of figuring out what memory chip this is, right? So it's 24 gigabyte, the memory sticks are 24 gigabytes, so the memory chip has to be 24 gigabit. Because 12 gigabit doesn't exist. And then because it's 6000 CL30, it has to be a Hynix memory chip, and Hynix currently only makes, it has to be this Hynix memory chip, because Hynix, this is the only memory chip that does timings this low, at this speed with this voltage. There's not really any other options for what Corsair could have used to make these memory sticks with this spec. As in, literally, there are no other options. Like, right now, 24 gig kits with this kind of timing and speed have to be Hynix. And it is both timing and speed. If the speed was significantly lower, Corsair could have maybe managed to find a Micron chip that does timings. Like, these timings at, like, 4800 might work on a Micron chip. But anyway, so that's one way you can tell, is just like the spec of the memory kit itself. But with Corsair memory sticks, you also have the option to just look at the version number, right, which is on the label here. And the way the version number works is the first number tells us which manufacturer it is. So 5 is Hynix, 4 is Samsung, and 3 is Micron. So this is a 5, so that tells us this uses Hynix memory chips. The 53 tells us the density, so in this case that's 24 gigabit. If this was a 16 gig stick, it would be a 43, or if it was a 32 gig stick using two 16 gigabit memory chips, then it would be a 43. And then the 13 tells us 13th letter in the alphabet, MDI, right? Because M is the 13th letter in the alphabet. Which is kind of an interesting change from like DDR4 Corsair kits, because on DDR4 MDI was, I think, 9 or something. Like, it was a really random number. But now, as far as I'm aware, Corsair memory kits actually just the letter in the the letter matches the alphabet. So like 16 gigabit ADI has a version number, Hynix 16 gigabit ADI has a version number of 54301. 16 gigabit MDI is 54313, and 24 gigabit MDI, which is what we're looking at here, is 55313. So that's one thing that I actually really like about Corsair memory kits, is that it's super easy to tell what memory chip is under the heat spreaders without having to pull the heat spreaders. Unfortunately, this isn't on the actual, like, say, packaging, so it is, like, the version number is only on the memory sticks themselves. And the reason Corsair does it this way is because technically there are certain speed bins that they offer where you can get, like, different version numbers for the same spec. So, yeah, so, like, a good example of that would be, like, 3200 CL16 DDR4, which you can get basically any memory chip on that. So that has, like, a million different version numbers that you can get. But, you know, if you, like, I like it, like, when buying secondhand memory on eBay, you can just figure out what you're buying by like, if the seller takes a picture of the label, you can tell what memory chips you're going to get, which is how I've, like, bought Nanya-based memory kits and that kind of thing, like novelty memory chips, if you will. So anyway, yeah, so that's one thing that I do appreciate with Corsair memory kits, because it makes it really easy to find specific memory chips, at least secondhand. Not when you're buying new, because obviously the version number isn't displayed on like store listings, but you're buying secondhand kits, or if you have physical access to the memory kit, like, you can check the labels through the packaging, right? The packaging does show the labels on the memory sticks. So if you're in, like, a physical store and you're buying, like, the thing is, I've never bought RAM in a physical store, so that just doesn't seem like a realistic scenario. But I think in the US they have something called a micro center. And there you could probably actually check what version number your memory sticks have before you buy them. So, though I usually, you know, like, I mainly use the version number on eBay. But anyway, so that's the other way that with specifically Corsair memory kits, you can figure out what memory chips you have. Now then, let's take a look at what stress tests I run. So I run 2 hours of Y-Cruncher VT3. Also, if you're wondering how to run that, this is the, like, batch file that I use for running Y-Cruncher. And yeah, so we have 2 hours of Y-Cruncher VT3, and then also almost 13 hours of Carhu RAM test. And honestly, I'd be okay dailying these settings, especially because I'm not pushing them super hard. Like, I've made videos in the past complaining about how the Intel memory controller is just very inconsistent. Yeah, but that the inconsistency becomes much less of a problem when you just don't try to run very high memory speed. So we're at DDR5-6933, which is a pretty like, it's an actual overclock. Like, this is the one, because I did actually specifically request these memory sticks from Corsair as a review sample. They didn't just, like, randomly decide to send me this spec. Like, I specifically wanted this spec. And the reason I wanted this spec is because, for once, I would have a DDR5 memory kit that I don't need to underclock on Intel CPUs. Because I do have, like, some 7200 rated kits and, like, 7800 rated kits and 8000, and I have one, actually no, I have I have one 7800 rated kit, and I have one 8000 rated kit. And both the 7800 and the 8000 rated kit, like, on the vast majority of Intel motherboards, that being all but one of them, I need to underclock those kits, because they just do not work at those speeds. And even the 7200 kits, like, those don't work on auto settings. Like, you actually need to, like, do stuff to make them not crash stress test. Instead of just, like, turning on XMP and it working. This is probably because the memory controllers that, like, my Intel CPUs have kind of suck. But I am not willing to put any more effort into investigating that, so here we are. So with this being a 6000 CL30 kit, I do actually get to do overclocking instead of desperately trying to figure out how to get the Intel memory controller to stop erroring. So yeah, 6933, because I did try 7200. Like, honestly, I don't think this memory speed, like, this is the limit of the memory sticks here. This is just like, if I push the memory speed any higher, the memory controller gets very upset, and I have decided to just not deal with that anymore. I have better things to do. Or more like, I have things that I find more enjoyable than dealing with Intel's memory controller. So, yeah, as for actual performance, this will demolish any XMP profile. Yeah, quite simply. So anyway, oh, and I guess we should check the temperatures. So the memory sticks... So what's really annoying with a lot of DDR5 kits is that they have temperature sensor glitching. So if you leave the sticks running for long enough, you will pretty inevitably get a minimum temperature reading of like 16 degrees Celsius. And I think if you keep the memory sticks at around, there's like a bug where you'll get like plus 13 degrees basically. Well, it's not even plus 13 degrees, but there's like a few different high temperatures that it'll bug out to. So if your memory sticks are running in like the low to mid, like around 40 degrees Celsius, it's pretty common that the temperature sensor will just randomly report that the memory hit 63.8 degrees, which it didn't. The sensor just sucks. And so when you have a maximum temperature of 47.8, it basically means that the memory was running somewhere around like 35 degrees Celsius probably. Which makes sense because the ambient air temperature, as you can tell from the current like idle temperature, is, you know, in the like 20 degrees Celsius range, and I do have a fan. DDR5, like the thing is, RAM can get very hot, but it doesn't produce a lot of heat. So if you have just like any amount of airflow, it actually really knocks the temperatures down. So yeah, so this like 47.8, like that's actually a bugged out temperature reading. Yeah, it would have actually been ideal if I had just left RAM test running for like when I started this video, but unfortunately, I wanted to run yCruncher a second time. So like I ran yCruncher, then RAM test, and then I ran another yCruncher, and you can't unfortunately open a second instance of RAM test. I guess I could have used HCI for loading the memory sticks to a high temperature. Oh well, should have thought of that sooner. But yeah, so the memory sticks were probably running at around like 35 degrees, because that right there, like 47.8 very specifically is a bugged out temperature reading. And that seems to, I don't think I have a single DDR5 kit that doesn't do this. Yeah. You also, it's also very common for some, well, okay, this one isn't doing it, but there's also some DDR5 kits that will have like completely bugged out voltage readings. So you'll get some very silly things like 1.1 volts as your memory voltage reading, which, like when you're running, like you set the memory voltage to say like 1.6 volts and it'll bug out to like 1.1 volts on the sensor. And it's like, yeah, if it actually did that, it would have crashed, which it didn't. But anyway, so basically, yeah, the fan kept the memory sticks very, very cool. Yeah, because the thing is, like, it's worth it's worth keeping in mind that if you are actually running like a case, like if you're running the system in a case, it's not that unrealistic for the internal air temperature inside a case to reach like 35 degrees Celsius. And obviously, if the ambient temperature is 35 degrees Celsius, your RAM can't be cooler than the ambient air temperature. So, yeah. Though the main thing that gets affected by your memory temperatures are basically the TRCD timing over here, and then the TREFI timing. Also, if you're wondering about MemTweakit, I'll try to leave a link in the description to this. So anyway, yeah, that's everything I wanted to show in the OS, because the more important stuff is obviously in the BIOS. So, at this point, we're gonna reboot and take a look at the settings in the BIOS. So anyway, here we are. And for voltages, VCCSA, I'm at 1.2 volts, which honestly for 6933 is probably unnecessarily high. I wouldn't be surprised if it worked with much lower system agent voltage. But at the same time, 1.2 volts is just like, if you're going to be pushing the memory speed higher, then you might actually need 1.2 volts. And there's no, like, there is, with DDR5, on like 13th gen, 14th gen, even 12th gen, this is a real concern that with some CPUs and some motherboards and some memory kits, you can actually set the system agent voltage so high that it causes instability. So this isn't a voltage where it's like, oh, you just want to set it to like 1.3 volts and then forget about it, because a lot of the time that's actually worse than having it set to 1.2. And I have heard of some cases where like certain CPUs only work well with very, very low system agent voltage, like say 1.1 volts. But I've generally found that like 1.2 volts is fine, especially if you're not pushing the memory speed too high. Right, which 6933 is still within the like sanity territory for Intel memory controllers in my experience. Whereas once you start going like 7200 and higher, things get weird and very annoying. So yeah, anyway, for VDDQ, I'm on 1.35 volts, VDD2 1.4. This is actually basically the auto settings for this motherboard. Like auto VDDQ would have been 1.4 volts, which I think is too high, but the problem I have with, like, my main issue with Intel CPUs is that it is really hard to know what to do with, like, VDDQ, VDD2, memory voltages as well, because basically, depending on what motherboard you have, what BIOS version you're on, what memory you're running, you need completely different values. Now, again, you can mostly avoid a lot of this difficulty, but simply running lower memory speeds, and then the memory controller just kind of has a much larger operating window where it works. But yeah, the higher you push the memory speed, the narrower the band of functional settings gets, and the more frustrating it gets to find, because a lot of the instability takes forever to show up. So anyway, and here for voltages, I'm running 1.45 volts on VDD and VDDQ at 1.4, which is, like, the VDDQ is just the stock voltage for this memory kit, actually. And VDD, I'm at 1.45 because CL32 is at 6933 is actually kind of low. Yeah, and with the memory timings, basically the lower timings you want to run, well, more like the lower the cast latency you want to run. Technically, TRCD scales a little bit with VDD voltage, but not really. And TRCD is actually more... I think TRCD is actually like more temperature sensitive than it scales with voltage. So you might find that as you raise the, like if you're running a lot of voltage, the TRCD actually gets worse because of the higher thermals. But for CAS latency, like CAS latency pretty consistently, you can run it lower the more memory, like the more VDD voltage you have. The other timings don't really tend to benefit as much. So, yeah. So if let's say at 6933, if I wanted to run, say, CL30, I would probably need like 1.6 volts instead of 1.45, which is a bit silly because all of the other timings would basically stay the same and it would just be like CAS latency at 30. So, yeah. So 1.45 volts just because the CAS, like CL32 at 6933 is kind of low for 20, well, depends, but it's on the lower side for Hynix 24 gigabit MDI at 6933. Also, I guess I should have pointed out what BIOS version I'm on. I'm on F5. And so, yeah, so that's the memory voltages. Don't think I changed anything in the advanced. Yeah, I didn't change anything over here. So now we're just going to go look at the memory timings. Oh, and I guess so you can see I have fast boot disabled, and the reason, so this is really kind of frustrating for me with Gigabyte motherboards, because they do not you'd think that if you just change a timing, it would automatically force a retrain. It doesn't. So if you're tuning your memory on a Gigabyte motherboard, you basically have to disable fast boot so that it actually, like, applies your memory timings as you're, adjusting things, which is very annoying. You'd think there'd be some mechanism in the BIOS to just automatically detect a change in timings and force a retrain, but there isn't. Which is, yeah, an interesting choice. And this only happens with Intel boards. AMD boards don't do this, mostly because I think, like, with AMD board, well, it's probably because AMD memory controllers don't support on-the-fly timing adjustments, so it, like, requires a retrain in order to change timings. But anyway, so if you are tuning your memory on a Gigabyte motherboard, you should disable fast boot. Otherwise, the boards are very reluctant to retrain on their own, and that means, like, if you change timings, a lot of the time you'll, like, reboot, and your old timings are still there. Like, your new timings won't be applied, which, yeah, is very silly, but oh well. Anyway, and then in the training options, I just turn on the round trip latency. The reason you'd want to do this is, now this, admittedly, I haven't run into issues with this on 13th gen or 14th gen. On 12th gen, you could, like, sometime on some CPUs with 12th gen, if you turn this on, the stability just disintegrates. I've not run into that with 13th gen and 14th gen, and it does slightly improve your memory latency. So there's really no reason not to enable this with the newer CPUs. But actually, like, generally you should try to enable this, and if it works for you, you should keep it enabled. And if it doesn't, then you should just not enable it. But that basically just tightens the round trip latencies and improves memory performance. So anyway, let's get to the memory timing. So CAS latency is at 32. This is basically, like, without raising the voltage, it's not going to do CL30 at 6933. I did actually test CL30 at 6800, and at 6800 it needed like 1.55 volts, which is why I'm assuming that for 6933 it would have probably needed 1.6. Anyway, so CL32, because, didn't really want to run insane voltage. TRCD 42, this could have probably been a 41. TRP's at 42 as well, because on Gigabyte motherboards, Gigabyte still hasn't implemented the, so this is kind of, yeah, so fun story. Skylake CPU, like from Skylake to Comet Lake, the TRP register didn't exist. There was no way to set the TRP timing because the TRP register, like, there wasn't a TRP register. The TRP timing was your TRCD timing. And with 11th gen, that changed. So on 11th gen CPUs, at least if your motherboard is implemented correctly, you can set a different TRP timing from your TRCD timing. And the same is true for 12th gen, 13th gen, 14th gen. Like, these all have a dedicated TRP register. gigabytes BIOS doesn't have a way of setting the TRP register. It just uses whatever your TRCD value is, which is another just gigabyte thing. Luckily, this isn't like, from a performance perspective, this isn't really the end of the world because the TRP timing doesn't have that much performance impact. But it is kind of annoying that you can't set it. And another thing you can't set is write TRCD. Right? So on gigabyte motherboards, you should always set your well, it's not you should always set your TRP to the same thing as TRCD, but if you set it to something different, the board will just use the TRCD setting anyway. So, yeah, or actually it might use whichever one is higher. I'm not sure what the rule is, but like technically these two should be separate settings, but on gigabyte motherboards they aren't. And there should also technically be, for 13th gen and 14th gen, there should be a TRCDW register, and there isn't. Or like there should be a TRCDW setting. The register is on the CPU, but there isn't a setting for it in the BIOS, which is just, yeah, more gigabyte BIOS things. So you're kind of like, luckily, neither of those really makes that much of a performance difference, because you're generally not going to be limited, like under most circumstances, your memory isn't going to be, like, especially write operations aren't generally going to be latency restricted, so having like a really low TRCDW, while neat, because you can actually set it incredibly low, you can set it to like 12, even with like you could have a TRCD, like a read TRCD of 40 and a write TRCD of 12, and that'll regularly work just fine because of how write operations work. But the funny thing is, like being able to do a write operation 30 cycles faster generally doesn't make that much of a difference to, or more like starting a write operation 30 cycles faster generally doesn't make too much of a difference to performance. So it's not really like, I wish it was available. At the same time, it's not that big a deal. And the same is true for TRP, because TRP is used, like, under most circumstances, you shouldn't be, like, your memory performance shouldn't be limited by the TRP timing. There are specific scenarios where TRP is the bottleneck, but those are rare. So, yeah, it's not... also, your TRP isn't gonna get that much lower. Like, for this, I would expect the TRP to maybe work at, like, 36 or something. Which, like, 6 cycles of TRP is, like, it's nice that you could run it lower, but it's not, you know, it's not going to drastically change the performance. Really, most of the performance benefits of manually tuning your DDR5 timings come from your refresh interval and, like, refresh cycle timings. So, yeah, anyway, going through, we have TRAS at 44. This could probably be lower, but TRAS is, like, that makes even less of a difference to performance than any of the other primary timings. Like, yeah. So, and on 24 gigabit MDI, it does actually, like, so for ADI, a lot of the time you can just set it to 28, or even lower, if the CPU supports it being lower, but with 24 gigabit MDI, TRAS actually does, like, you can actually set it too low, like, so low that it's unstable quite easily. So, like, yeah, like, I wouldn't, like, something around 40 is just kind of like a lazy option that works. So 44 it is. Anyway, then we have cast write latency, which I've set to 28. This could actually probably go lower. Maybe even 24 would work. Hynix memory chips are just very, very fast at cast write latency for some reason. That's just been a very consistent thing with Hynix DDR5 chips, is the cast write latency just can be really low. Like, I think I've seen some setups be able to run cast write latency at like 16, even at relatively high clocks. Because, yeah, that's just like, evidently Hynix memory chips are just very good at receiving, like, writing data. So, yeah, that's cool. Then we have TRRDS and TRRDL at 8 and 12. This is probably well, it's not a huge weakness, but this is definitely one of the weaknesses going from, like, 24 gig, like, from 16 gigabit ADI to 24 gigabit MDI. This is one of the, like, weaker timings. Which is that, like, on 16 gigabit ADI, a lot of the time you can just run TRRDS at 4. On 24 gigabit MDI, a lot of the time that doesn't work. And then TRRDL is even weaker, as in like 9 will often not be an option. So yeah, that's why I have it at 12. Luckily, this doesn't really affect performance too much because actual like read and write bursts on DDR5 are 8 cycles long. So being able to activate a whole bunch of rows faster than in less time than each individual read or write burst does technically free up some, does technically have some minor performance benefits, but it's like not, 812 is not the end of the world from a performance perspective, even though like it sounds a lot worse than like the ideal, technically the register limit for these timings is 4/4, right? And there are DDR5 memory chips that can do 4/4, but because of how DDR5 works, the difference between 4/4 and like 8/8 is quite minimal. And the same is true for like 812. Like 812 is really not bad because the memory controller will generally try to avoid using the TRRDL timing. And because DDR5 has a lot of bank groups, that's not very difficult. In fact, if the memory controller is doing a good job, it can basically never use that timing. So yeah, I'm not like, so, and this isn't even like, there isn't anything I can really do about this, right? It's like, oh, you could raise the, raising the voltage isn't going to let me significantly reduce the TRRD timings. So this is just like, yeah, this is 24 gigabit MDI. It doesn't do super low TRRD timings like some of the earlier Hynix memory chips did. Anyway, then we get a bunch of memory. Oh, I guess I should have mentioned that like TRC does not exist on Intel CPUs. Intel CPUs do not have a TRC register. So you do not have to do anything about that. You can just pretend that doesn't exist. Anyway, then we have TWR, which also doesn't exist on Intel CPUs. The TWR timing that we see over here, that is actually calculated from 2 timings that are further down in the BIOS. Actually, no, it's calculated from like TCWL and, from TCWL and TWR pre. Or at least it should be, depending on how the BIOS is implemented. So there's no, physically, the CPU does not know what a TWR is. Literally, as far as the CPU is concerned, this setting shouldn't be in the BIOS. Intel motherboards are just weird like that, where you just have a bunch of timings that the CPU doesn't even support, but they're just in the BIOS. And that's what we have with WTRS, WTRL, TCCDS, TCCDL, TCCDL-WR. These are all timings that they don't exist on the CPU. They're just not there. I've always wondered why Intel motherboard manufacturers insist on having them in the BIOS, because they don't exist in any of the official Intel documentation. And a bunch of the other timings do. TRFC2 has a register. TRFC per bank has a register. So TRFC2's at 600. This is actually pretty close to minimized for 6933. So if you're thinking of doing a 24 gigabit MDI overclock and pushing the memory speed higher to say 7200, 7400, 7600, and you're thinking of using similar timings to what I have here, you're almost certainly going to have to loosen out TRFC2 and TRFC per bank. So yeah, so these are at 600, 400. So if you wanted to go up to say, okay, I'm not going to try to do that in my head. So yeah, but these are pretty close to the limit of what it will work at 6933. So if you're thinking of using them at 7200, decent chance they won't work. You're going to have to set them looser than that. Anyway, TFall's at 16, which admittedly doesn't do anything because the TRRD timings are at 812, but also there's no reason not to set it to 16. Right? Because the way the TFall timings works is if the, whichever is greater is what the memory controller ends up using. And so setting the TFall below TRRD times 4, just kind of yeah, so the memory controller is just going to use TRRD times 4. There's no downside to that. TFall, the only reason you would ever want to set it, actually worry about this timing is if you're working with some memory chip that's really weird about back-to-back activate commands. And generally, I think it's a better approach to just set the T-fall to like 16 and then worry about the TRRD timings rather than trying to like make low TRRD timings work by having a really loose T-fall. That, like, functionally, performance-wise, you're going to end up with the same result. Anyway, command rate's at 2T. There's a small chance 1T would have actually worked, but it can cause a lot more problems. And then I don't think it had, like, the performance improvement wouldn't be enough to justify the effort. Refresh interval is at 65,432. Basically an arbitrarily high number. If you have really low memory temperatures, you could also use something like that. If you have very high memory temperatures, you might want to use something like this, right? Like 32,000-ish if your memory is running really hot. If your memory is running really cold, then you can use like over 100,000 or something around 100,000. And if you're running sort of medium temperatures, then around 65,000 tends to work quite well. So now it got set to the highest value, and 260,000 is only viable for benchmarks in my experience. Like, you can run benchmarks at 260,000 refresh interval. It basically never works for stress tests. So yeah, but under most circumstances, like, and by temperatures, like, basically up to, like, 60 degrees Celsius, you should be okay with 65,000 refresh interval. If you're going over 60, you might have to lower the refresh interval. So, yeah, again, if you have a fan on the RAM, this really shouldn't be too much of a concern. Anyway, oh, I guess I could have maxed out TREFI X9. I kind of forgot about that one. Yeah, so from, like, ideally for performance, you would want that to be at 255. Some motherboards set that to 255 for you automatically. This one doesn't. I didn't realize it didn't, but yeah, too late. So, and obviously I would have to rerun the stress test if I bumped it to 255. So that's a bit annoying. And basically, if you're wondering what TREFI X9 does, it's used for delaying, like, basically the memory controller can choose to, like, delay a bunch of refresh cycle commands and sort of group them up and then do them later. And it can do this with up to 9 refresh commands, right? So it can basically delay 9 refresh commands and then do them all at once, and this controls how much delaying can be done. So yeah, this has a minor impact on performance, like a lot less than the TREFI timing itself. Anyway, then we have TXP, which is set to 4. TXP DLL set to 4. That's the register limit for that one. TRD, TPR, power down in it. Like, these are power down in related timings. 2, 4. Right to power down enable is at 48. Read to pre-charge is at 12. Write to pre-charge is at 48. These could potentially go a bit lower, like write to power down enable, write to pre-charge. These could probably go a little bit lower. TCP dead is on auto because it basically doesn't do anything. Actually, you could, in many scenarios, you could leave the power down enable timings on auto as well. They really don't affect performance very much. And then we have TCKE, which I have at 8. The register limit for that one is 4. That doesn't always work, like, from a stability perspective. Like, TCK4 isn't always stable. Anyway, then we have the back-to-back timings. TRD SG16, honestly, a bit loose for 6933. Could have probably run 14. TRD DG8, there's no... Well, technically you can set it to 7, but if you do that, the memory controller just rounds it back up to 8 anyway, so... it's functionally the same thing. Like, having it at 8 or 7 is the same thing, and if you set it to 6, it's not going to work because 6 clock cycles is shorter than the burst length of DDR5, right? DDR5, your read bursts and your write bursts are 8 cycles long, so back-to-back reads have to have at least 8 cycle delays between them. Right? That's where the 8 comes from. And also why, if you set it to 7, it gets rounded up to 8. Actually, that might be more related to the fact that the Intel memory controller is permanently in 2-to-1 mode, but the fact that it doesn't do TRD DG7. But yeah. So that 8 is just like a physical limitation of how DDR5 works. So you can't go below that. Then we have read to write, same group, different group. These are both at 20. Probably could have done 18. It's worth noting that for actually all of the tertiary timings, as far as I can tell, so tertiaries means like back-to-back timing. So like read to read, same group is a tertiary timing, right? That's this last set of timings here. So from my testing, the Intel memory controller does not support odd timing. So like 15 has the same performance as 16, or 13 has the same performance as 14. So yeah, and I'm not sure if this is due to the gear mode or because of how DDR5 works. One of the two. But because on DDR4, odd timings did work. On DDR4, you couldn't set the different group timing below 4 because DDR4 used 4-cycle burst lengths. But anyway, so SGDG, these are both at 20. Potentially, they might have worked at 18. It's not, going from 20 to 18 wouldn't have been a massive performance. Like, the funny thing here is that from a performance benefit perspective, most of the performance gain here is entirely in the refresh interval timing. Because if you look at the refresh interval timing, you'll notice that the JEDEC specification is 4,679 clock cycles, which is basically that means your memory is getting refreshed every 4,679 clock cycles. So like going from something like that to 65,000 is a big performance improvement, and then everything else is kind of not that big a deal in comparison, right? So that leads to the kind of funny situation where, I'm going through these timings and saying like, yeah, this one timing also doesn't really have that much of a performance impact on its own. Because it's true. Like, the only one that really does a lot is your refresh interval, and that's assuming you're starting at JEDEC. There are some other boards out there that will use higher auto refresh interval time, like settings. So on those motherboards, loosening out the refresh intervals further even has less of a performance gain. But yeah, this is not one of those. Anyway, then we have right to right, same group, and this I definitely could have run like 14 or 12. Yeah, the funny Hynix things where the right to right timings can go significantly lower than the read. Well, the right to right can go significantly lower than read to read a lot of the time. But like I mentioned earlier, write operations don't tend to be particularly important for performance. In fact, they're so not important for performance that AMD CPUs literally don't have as much write bandwidth as they have read bandwidth due to their physical design. So yeah, that's kind of why, if you wanted to get every little bit out of an Intel CPU, yeah, you could go and try to run this at 12. But if you just want some daily settings that are faster than an XMP profile, setting this to 16 is more than enough, generally speaking. And then we get to write to read, same group, different group, and these I have at 56 of 44. These aren't minimized, by the way, so they might go a bit lower. But yeah, I'm not sure how much lower. So, and that's the tertiary timings, and then everything else is just on auto. Because I've not really had any benefits from trying to adjust anything else down here. And technically, I should point out that all of these these are not timings. These settings down here, the RTT, NOM, RTT, these are all resistances. So these are used for optimizing the signal quality, or yeah, these are for optimizing the signal integrity. These do not affect performance; they affect stability. And if you're wondering how you would test these, brute force, which is why why I generally just leave them on auto, because manually trying to optimize these, especially on DDR5, takes forever. So yeah. And then the round-trip latency timings. So these are actually timings. So the round-trip latencies, these are actual timings. And my experience with trying to adjust those is that everything breaks if you try to change them. So I don't. So yeah, that's it. I guess I should have, like, gear mode on auto, it's going to be gear 2. Also, if you're wondering why there's no gear 1 option, because Intel's DDR5 memory controller does not support gear 1. And I think that's... Oh, I guess some people might be wondering, like, what do the high bandwidth and the low latency options do? These literally just preload a bunch of timings that, like, Gigabyte expects to work on most memory kits. That's all they do. So if you're manually tuning your memory, these don't, like, if you're manually setting your timings, enabling these is pointless. These are only worth doing if you, like, are using XMP and you don't want to set your timings yourself. And there is a chance that they won't be stable, but you'll have to, like, check that, right? So yeah, and that's it for this setup. Intel memory overclocking is a lot less painful when you decide to simply not go above DDR5-7000. Which I find incredibly frustrating, because it's just like I'd like to go faster, but it's just so much work, and the performance gains are minimal. Yeah, because, like, most of the performance gain with actually memory overclocking in general is not really from the speed. Like, well, obviously if you're going from, like, DDR5-4800 to 6933, that's going to make a big difference. But, like, once you're talking about higher speeds, like 6800, 7200, 7600, the speed is really not as important as what timings you're running. So, like, 6933 with good timings is significantly faster than 7600 auto timings. Except for, like, synthetic workloads like the IDA memory bandwidth benchmark, because, well, especially the IDA memory bandwidth benchmark, the data set there is specifically optimized to be the best case scenario. So you can, like, that is, like, the one, like, that doesn't really care about timings very much because of how the data set is laid out. But if you have random memory accesses instead of, like, sequential memory accesses, the timings make more of a difference than the frequency does. That's not to say that you should run, like, DDR5-6000, because generally on an Intel CPU, 6800, 6933, 7000, if you're, like, even 7200, a lot of the time can be relatively easy. But, yeah, so something around 7000 is sort of where like, if you want something low effort and fast, that's where I would aim for with Intel CPUs. If you get lucky, you might have a CPU that does DDR5-8000 on a 4-DIMM motherboard. Those do exist. Like, I've seen one of them. Not in person, but I've seen screenshots of a CPU like that. But yeah, unfortunately, all of the, like, Intel chips that I have generally kind of get very annoying once, like, well, on 4-DIMM motherboards, they get very annoying at, like, 7200, and on 1-DIMM per channel motherboards, they get very annoying at, like, 7600. So, yeah, this is a 4-dimmer, so 6933 it is. So, yeah, anyway, hopefully this is somewhat interesting, or if not, somewhat helpful. And, yeah, that's it. So thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, hoodies, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. And I've also got a Bandcamp. There's links to all of that down in the description. It would be much appreciated if you'd check them out. And that's it. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.